Emily Carter walked unnoticed through the buzzing hallways of Boston University. To the casual observer, she was unremarkable, a quiet, studious young woman with her chestnut hair tied neatly in a ponytail and her expression neutral. Emily's presence was a whisper against the loud chatter of the other students. Her professors admired her diligence but rarely saw her hand raised in class. She was the kind of person people glanced at and promptly forgot, blending seamlessly into the background. Yet, beneath her unassuming exterior lay a life shaped by discipline and a mastery of skills far beyond the ordinary. Her father, Henry Carter, had spent decades as a Navy SEAL before retiring to civilian life. To him, raising Emily was not just about nurturing her, it was about preparing her for the unknown. Since she was 7 years old, he had insisted on a rigorous routine of martial arts and self-defense training. Morning after morning, their backyard sessions were filled with the rhythmic thuds of strikes on padded targets and the steady cadence of his voice imparting lessons that extended far beyond physical combat. "Discipline is the foundation of freedom," he would say, his piercing gaze never leaving hers as she practiced. "Control your body, control your mind, and nothing in this world will own you." Emily absorbed these lessons like a sponge, her young mind sharpening under his tutelage. While her classmates were spending their summers at camps or the beach, Emily was perfecting counterattacks and evasive maneuvers. By the time she reached high school, she could disarm an opponent twice her size in seconds. But Henry's training wasn't just about physical prowess, it was about fostering an unshakable inner strength. Her father's teachings became her armor, a silent confidence that shielded her from the everyday fears most people carried. Yet, she never sought to dominate or flaunt her abilities. To Emily, the true essence of strength was restraint. She participated in local martial arts tournaments only when pushed, winning easily but never lingering for applause. Her victories were private, their value measured by the self-discipline she maintained in every movement. Now, as a student at Boston University, Emily carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had defined her upbringing. The sprawling campus was a dynamic blend of students from around the world, its energy vibrant and ceaseless. Emily, however, preferred solitude. Her favorite corners of the library, the quiet nooks of the student lounge, and the late-night pathways lit by dim streetlights were her sanctuaries. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply understood the value of being unnoticed. "Being invisible makes you invincible," her father had often said, and Emily believed it. She walked the campus alone without fear, her senses attuned to the rhythm of her surroundings. She observed people as a predator might study its terrain, her intuition alert to changes in the environment. This awareness, however, would soon be tested in ways even her meticulous training could not have foreseen. One evening, Emily sat at her usual spot in the library, poring over case studies for her business management class. Outside, the October chill deepened, and the campus began to empty. Most students had retreated to their dorms or the bustling student union, leaving the library bathed in an eerie stillness. Emily lost herself in the pages of her notebook, unaware of how much time had passed until the librarian's voice broke her focus. "Library closes in 15 minutes, the woman announced softly, her words echoing through the cavernous room. Emily gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency, her notebook sliding into her backpack with a faint zip. As she stepped into the night air, she relished the quiet. The campus, so often alive with chatter and activity, felt like another world under the moonlight. Her footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone paths as she made her way toward her dorm, taking her usual shortcut behind the library. The narrow alley was flanked by a high brick wall on one side and a glass-paneled structure on the other. It was a path she had taken countless times without a second thought. Tonight, however, a subtle shift in the air set her senses on edge. Emily slowed her pace, her ears catching the faint sound of laughter. It was distant but growing louder, accompanied by the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on gravel. She glanced at the glass wall, its reflection revealing 5 figures trailing her at a calculated distance. They moved with a casual swagger, their postures betraying an arrogance she instantly recognized. Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained impassive. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, her fingers brushing against the metal clasp that she knew could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. Years of training had conditioned her to assess threats quickly and act decisively. She scanned her surroundings, noting the alley's limited exits and the uneven terrain beneath her boots. As the group closed in, their voices carried through the cold air. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, his tone laced with mockery. "You lost." Emily ignored the taunt, her focus sharpening. She continued walking, her stride steady but deliberate. "Don't be rude now," another voice chimed in. "We're just trying to be friendly." The laughter that followed was sharp and hollow, the kind of sound predators make when they know they have the upper hand. Emily stopped. Slowly, she turned to face them, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Her eyes locked onto the man at the front, Jake, their leader. His smirk was wide, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his leather jacket. Behind him, the others formed a loose semicircle, their movements coordinated yet relaxed. "You don't have to do this," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. Jake chuckled, his head tilting as if amused by her audacity. "Do what?" "We're just talking." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "You've made your point. Walk away." Jake's smirk faltered, irritation flashing across his face. "Or what? You gonna call for help?" Emily didn't respond. Her silence was unnerving, a quiet challenge that Jake couldn't ignore. He stepped forward, his confidence faltering for just a moment as he met her steady gaze. Then, with a scoff, he lunged. The moment his hand reached out, Emily moved. Her body shifted fluidly, sidestepping his grab with practiced ease. In one swift motion, she swung her backpack, its weight catching Jake square in the face. The force sent him stumbling backward, clutching his cheek in shock. The laughter stopped. Emily dropped her bag, her stance lowering as the others hesitated, their confidence visibly shaken. "Get her," Jake snarled, his voice thick with anger. Emily's pulse steadied, her training taking over. She was ready. The moment Jake barked his order, the air grew tense, crackling with an unspoken challenge. Emily's muscles coiled, ready for what was coming. The men hesitated for only a heartbeat before springing into action, their bravado clouding any sense of caution. Travis, the broadest of the group, charged first, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement as he raised a fist to strike. Emily moved with the precision of a dancer. She sidestepped his clumsy attack, pivoting on the balls of her feet. Her arm shot up, deflecting his swing and redirecting his momentum. Travis stumbled forward, off balance, and Emily capitalized on the moment. She delivered a sharp kick to the back of his knee, sending him crashing onto the ground with a pained grunt. Connor came next, his approach more calculated. He threw a quick jab, testing her defenses, but Emily's hands moved faster. She blocked his punch with her forearm, the impact reverberating up her arm, and retaliated with a sharp elbow strike to his ribs. The blow forced the air from his lungs, and he staggered back, clutching his side. "Is that all you've got?" Emily asked, her voice calm but cutting, as her sharp gaze darted between the remaining three men. Jake snarled, his face twisted in frustration. "Don't just stand there. Get her." Matt and Nick exchanged a glance, their bravado wavering. But with Jake's shout spurring them on, they rushed her from opposite sides, hoping to overwhelm her with their numbers. Emily's training took over, her movements swift and instinctive. As Matt lunged, she ducked under his arm, spinning around to avoid Nick's grasp. She grabbed Matt's wrist, twisting it sharply until he cried out, and used his own momentum to fling him into Nick. The two collided with a dull thud, their limbs tangling as they fell to the ground in a heap. Jake watched his crew struggle, his hands balling into fists. His confidence faltered for a split second before rage overtook him. He stepped forward, his teeth clenched. "You're gonna regret that," he growled, charging at Emily with a reckless fury. She stood her ground, her eyes narrowing as she assessed his approach. Jake threw a wild punch, aiming for her face, but she ducked, her movements fluid and deliberate. She grabbed his outstretched arm, twisting it and driving her knee into his stomach in one seamless motion. He gasped in pain, doubling over, and Emily shoved him away, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. "Get up," she said coldly, her voice sharp against the silence. Jake pushed himself up on shaky arms, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. Around him, his crew groaned as they struggled to recover, each of them nursing bruises and aching limbs. Travis managed to sit up, his face twisted in pain, while Connor leaned against the wall, still wheezing from the strike to his ribs. Matt and Nick remained on the ground, their attempts to untangle themselves half-hearted at best. Jake wiped at the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Emily. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice rough. Emily didn't answer. She stepped forward, her stance steady and her gaze unyielding. "This is your last warning," she said evenly. "Leave now, and you won't end up in the hospital." For a moment, it seemed as though Jake might take her advice. His hands twitched at his sides, his breath coming in ragged bursts. But his pride refused to let him back down. With a roar, he lunged at her again, his arms swinging wildly. Emily sighed inwardly, disappointment flickering in her chest. She dodged his clumsy attack with ease, stepping to the side and sweeping his legs out from under him. Jake hit the ground hard, the impact echoing through the alley. This time, he didn't get up. The alley fell silent, save for the labored breathing of Jake and his crew. Emily scanned the group, her posture relaxed but alert, ready for any sign of another attack. None of them moved. "You're lucky I held back," she said, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Next time, you won't be." Jake muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue. His eyes burned with humiliation as he avoided her gaze. Emily turned her back on him, her instincts tingling but her confidence unwavering. She bent to retrieve her bag, slinging it over her shoulder in one smooth motion. As she walked away, her footsteps echoing against the pavement, she felt their eyes on her, their anger and shame a palpable weight. She knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths, but she didn't care. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "You fight not to win, but to end the fight." And tonight, she had done just that. Her breath evened out as she left the alley, the quiet campus stretching before her like a sanctuary. Emily's movements betrayed no hint of the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had won, but she felt no satisfaction in it. The encounter had been a necessary lesson, for them and for herself. As she disappeared into the shadows, the men remained behind, their pride bruised and their bodies aching. None of them would forget what had just happened. And for Emily, the night had only reinforced what she already knew. Strength wasn't about dominance. It was about control. By morning, the events of the previous night had transformed from a fleeting confrontation into the most talked-about story on campus. Whispers of what had transpired behind the library spread with the inevitability of wildfire. As Emily walked to her morning class, she could feel the ripple of attention trailing her, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, eyes lingering on her a second too long, murmured conversations halting abruptly when she passed by. "Did you hear?" A girl in the hallway whispered loudly to her friend. "She took on 5 guys. Alone. No way. That's just a rumor," the friend scoffed, though her curious glance at Emily betrayed her doubt. "She doesn't look like she could fight her way out of a paper bag." Emily's face remained impassive, but the words weighed heavily on her. She had no intention of becoming the center of attention. Blending in had always been her strength, her shield. Now, her once invisible presence was glaringly visible. Students craned their necks in lecture halls to get a glimpse of her, and snippets of speculation buzzed through the air. Jake and his friends, however, were conspicuously absent from the usual campus spots. Though their bruises and wounded pride kept them away, their silence only added to the mystique of the story. Those who had seen them after the fight swore they looked humiliated, and their defeat became a source of amusement for some and curiosity for others. As the day wore on, Emily tried to focus on her routine, burying herself in coursework and retreating to her quiet corners. But the unease clung to her. The whispers weren't what troubled her most, it was the storm brewing inside her. For all her training, for all her father's lessons, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible line. That night, back in her dorm, Emily stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was calm, composed, but her mind churned with doubt. She replayed the fight in her head, dissecting every moment, every strike. Her movements had been precise, her actions calculated, but it was the surge of anger she'd felt, the raw satisfaction of overpowering her attackers that gnawed at her. When her phone buzzed, she welcomed the distraction. It was her father. She hesitated before answering, knowing his perceptiveness would leave little room for her to hide her turmoil. "Hey, Dad," she greeted, her voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "Emily," Henry said, his tone as firm and measured as always. "How's everything going?" She hesitated. "It's fine. Classes are good." There was a pause on the other end, and then Henry's voice softened. "You don't sound fine." Emily exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. She knew better than to lie to him. "Something happened last night," she admitted. She recounted the confrontation, sparing no detail. As she spoke, she expected her father to interrupt, to offer judgment or reprimand. But he listened silently, letting her voice carry the weight of the story. When she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "You defended yourself," he said finally. "That's what I trained you for." "But it didn't feel like just defense," Emily confessed. "I wanted to hurt them. I wasn't just reacting, I was angry. And I don't know if that's okay." Henry's voice grew thoughtful. "Anger is a natural response, Emily. But what matters is how you channel it. You didn't lose control, did you?" She shook her head, though he couldn't see it. "No. But it felt close." "That's the line you have to be careful of," he said. "Strength isn't just about what you can do physically. It's about knowing when to stop, when to walk away. You're not a weapon, you're a protector. Remember that." His words resonated, grounding her in the way they always had. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly. After they hung up, Emily sat in silence, her thoughts a little clearer. She decided she needed to do something to redirect her energy, to ensure the events of the night didn't define her. The next day, she visited the campus martial arts club. It wasn't a place she'd frequented before, preferring the solitude of her own training. But now, it felt like the right step. She approached Sensei Robert, the instructor, and explained her desire to volunteer, to help teach self-defense to students, particularly those who might feel as vulnerable as she had once been. Sensei Robert listened with interest, his eyes lighting up when she described her background. "We could use someone like you," he said. "But are you ready to take on the responsibility of being a role model?" Emily paused, considering the weight of his question. "I think it's exactly what I need," she replied. Her first day assisting in the club was humbling. The students looked at her with a mix of awe and apprehension, their whispers confirming they'd heard the stories. Emily ignored the attention, focusing on demonstrating techniques and emphasizing the principles her father had taught her: control, respect, and the importance of avoiding conflict whenever possible. Meanwhile, Jake and his friends were dealing with their own fallout. Their bruises had faded, but the sting of humiliation remained fresh. They couldn't walk through campus without hearing whispers or catching smirks. Jake, in particular, found himself grappling with emotions he didn't fully understand: shame, frustration, and a strange curiosity about the girl who had bested him. Late one afternoon, Jake found himself near the martial arts club. Through the open doors, he saw Emily teaching a group of students, her movements fluid and purposeful. He watched in silence, his mind racing. For the first time, he began to wonder if there was something to learn from her, not just about fighting, but about strength itself. The threads of their lives, once clashing, were beginning to intertwine again, setting the stage for something neither of them could yet predict. The rhythmic thuds of feet against the padded mats echoed in the dojo as Emily moved through a demonstration. The small group of students watched her intently, their gazes a mixture of admiration and apprehension. She guided them patiently, breaking each movement into manageable parts, emphasizing the importance of balance and control. For Emily, teaching was becoming less about instructing techniques and more about fostering confidence in her students. "You don't need strength to defend yourself," she said, addressing the group. Her voice was calm but firm, commanding their attention. "You need awareness, timing, and the resolve to act when it counts." She demonstrated a simple wrist grab escape, then gestured for a volunteer. A petite girl named Mia stepped forward hesitantly, her shoulders tense with nervousness. Emily smiled encouragingly. "Don't think about overpowering me," she said softly. "Think about redirecting my energy." Mia nodded, and with Emily's guidance, executed the move successfully. The girl's face lit up with triumph, a spark of newfound confidence shining through. Watching her, Emily felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that she was making a difference, however small. From the back of the dojo, Jake stood watching the scene unfold. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His bruises had mostly faded, but the sting of his defeat lingered, etched deeper into his pride than into his skin. At first, his curiosity about Emily had been born of anger and humiliation, but as he observed her now, something else stirred, respect, albeit reluctant. After the class ended, Emily began tidying the mats, her focus undeterred by the lingering presence behind her. Jake approached cautiously, his footsteps hesitant against the wooden floor. "You've got their attention," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Emily looked up, her expression neutral. She didn't need to ask who he was. The memory of their encounter behind the library was still vivid. "What do you want?" she asked evenly. Jake hesitated, unaccustomed to the vulnerability he felt in her presence. "To talk," he said finally. I need to understand something." Emily raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Understand what?" "Why?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why didn't you just run? You could have avoided the whole thing." She studied him for a moment before responding. "I don't run from people like you," she said simply. Her words struck a nerve, and Jake's jaw tightened. "People like me. People who think strength comes from intimidating others," she said, her tone steady but sharp. "You wanted power over someone you thought was weaker. And when you didn't get it, you panicked." Jake flinched at her bluntness but couldn't argue. He looked away, his gaze falling to the mats beneath his feet. "I wasn't always like this," he muttered. Emily's eyes softened slightly. She had heard variations of this story before, pain buried beneath layers of anger, fear disguised as bravado. "Then why are you now?" she asked, her voice losing its edge. He didn't answer immediately, the weight of the question pressing on him. Finally, he said, "I don't know how else to be." There was a pause as the words settled between them. Then, to his surprise, Emily spoke. "If you're willing to learn, I can show you something different," she said. "But it's not easy. It's not about proving yourself to anyone else. It's about changing how you see yourself." Jake stared at her, his skepticism warring with something deeper. "And what makes you think I can change?" Emily shrugged. "That's not up to me. It's up to you." The next day, Jake returned to the dojo, this time stepping onto the mats. His presence drew whispers from the other students, but Emily silenced them with a glance. She introduced him as a new participant and paired him with a seasoned student for basic drills. Jake struggled at first, his movements awkward and uncoordinated. Frustration flared within him, but he kept his temper in check, the memory of Emily's words anchoring him. As the weeks passed, Jake's persistence began to show results. His punches grew sharper, his footwork steadier. But more importantly, his demeanor began to shift. The chip on his shoulder started to erode, replaced by a quiet determination. Emily watched his progress carefully, offering guidance when needed but allowing him to find his own path. Unbeknownst to Jake, his transformation was also influencing his friends. Travis, Connor, Matt, and Nick had been avoiding the dojo, their egos still too bruised to face Emily. But Jake's stories of discipline and focus began to pique their curiosity. One by one, they started showing up, standing at the edges of the mats, watching from the sidelines. It was Nick who broke the silence first, stepping forward after a class. "Think we could join too?" he asked, his tone sheepish. Emily regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "If you're serious," she said. The group's journey was far from smooth. Old habits died hard, and their initial sessions were fraught with clumsy mistakes and moments of frustration. But Emily was patient, guiding them with the same quiet determination she had shown Jake. Over time, the dojo became a place of transformation, not just for Jake and his friends, but for Emily as well. Teaching them forced her to confront her own struggles, to find balance between strength and empathy. She realized that her father's lessons were not just about her, they were about what she could give back to others. As the days turned into weeks, the dojo buzzed with a newfound energy. The small group of former aggressors began to integrate with the other students, their rough edges slowly smoothing. They weren't just learning techniques, they were learning respect, discipline, and the power of vulnerability. And though Emily rarely showed it, she felt a quiet pride in watching them grow. For the first time, she began to believe that even the most broken paths could lead to something better. The dojo was unusually quiet as Emily finished her drills, the faint sound of her movements breaking the stillness. Jake lingered near the edge of the room, watching her with an intensity that hinted at a brewing internal struggle. Over the past weeks, he had transformed from an arrogant, volatile presence into a diligent, albeit reserved, student. But tonight, something about him seemed unsettled. As the last of the students trickled out, Jake remained, his gaze fixed on the floor. Emily approached, wiping sweat from her brow. "You've been holding back all day," she said simply, her tone neutral but probing. Jake hesitated before looking up, the conflict in his eyes evident. "There's something I need to say," he admitted, his voice low. Emily folded her arms, waiting patiently. "I never apologized," he began, his words slow and deliberate, as though each one cost him a piece of himself. "For that night. For what we tried to do to you. I was angry. At myself, at everything. Taking it out on you was wrong." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. His remorse seemed genuine, but she knew words alone didn't erase damage. "And what do you want from me now?" she asked, her voice steady. "I don't want anything," Jake replied quickly. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now. What you said, about strength not being about control over others, that stuck with me." Emily's posture softened slightly, though her gaze remained sharp. "Acknowledging it is a start," she said. "But the real work is what you do from here. Actions speak louder than apologies." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. "I'm trying," he said quietly. The following weeks marked a turning point for Jake and his friends. Their presence at the dojo became more consistent, their focus more disciplined. Travis, once quick to anger, now listened intently to Emily's instructions, his movements calculated rather than impulsive. Connor and Matt began helping newer students, their camaraderie a far cry from the aggressive pack mentality they'd once exhibited. Nick, however, was the first to openly voice his thoughts. After a particularly grueling sparring session, he approached Emily, his usual bravado replaced with sincerity. "Do you really think people like us can change?" he asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. Emily looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Change isn't about erasing who you were," she said. "It's about choosing who you want to become. It's not easy, but it's possible if you're willing to put in the work." Nick nodded, her words clearly resonating. As the group's transformation became evident, whispers around campus shifted. Once the subjects of ridicule and disdain, Jake and his friends began earning quiet respect. Their efforts in the dojo spilled into other areas of their lives. Better grades, less bravado, and a willingness to engage with others more genuinely. Despite their progress, Jake still wrestled with the weight of his past. Late one evening, after the dojo had emptied, he lingered again, his thoughts heavy. Emily noticed and paused in her routine, sensing his need to talk. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said, her voice breaking the silence. Jake looked up, surprised by her insight. "What if it's too late to fix everything I've done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's never too late," Emily replied firmly. "But fixing it doesn't mean erasing it. It means owning it and learning from it." Her words struck a chord, and Jake nodded slowly, the weight on his shoulders seeming to lift slightly. Meanwhile, Emily's role as a mentor began to reshape her own outlook. Teaching Jake and the others forced her to confront her own fears, her anger, her need for control, and the lingering doubt about her choices that night. In guiding them, she found a sense of purpose that transcended her own struggles. The dojo became a hub of growth, not just for the group but for everyone involved. Students who had once felt isolated began to form bonds, their shared journeys creating a sense of community. Emily watched it all unfold, her quiet pride growing with each small victory. And though she rarely acknowledged it, she began to see Jake and his friends not as adversaries, but as proof that even the most broken paths could lead to redemption. Months passed, and the dojo transformed into more than just a place to learn self-defense. It became a sanctuary for growth, discipline, and second chances. Emily's once silent presence now resonated throughout the campus, her name spoken with admiration and respect. She remained humble, her focus not on the attention but on the lives she had helped reshape. Jake had changed the most visibly. No longer the cocky, volatile leader of his group, he arrived early to every class, often helping to set up the mats or guide newer students through their routines. His movements, once fueled by aggression, were now measured and purposeful. But the greatest shift wasn't in his physical abilities, it was in the way he carried himself. There was a calmness in him now, a self-awareness that had taken root and flourished. One afternoon, after an intense sparring session, Jake approached Emily. He was drenched in sweat, his breath coming in steady bursts, but his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence as Emily cleaned up the mats. "Dangerous habit," Emily replied with a small smirk, though her tone invited him to continue. Jake chuckled, the sound genuine. "You know, when I first came here, I didn't think I'd last. I thought I'd mess up, or you'd kick me out." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But you didn't. You gave me a chance. You didn't have to, and I'll never forget that." Emily stopped what she was doing and turned to face him fully. "You earned it," she said simply. "I could open the door, but you're the one who walked through it." Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "Still," he said, his voice quieter, "thank you." It wasn't just Jake and his friends who had found strength through the dojo. Mia, the shy student who could barely muster the courage to raise her hand, now moved with confidence during drills. A group of students who had started as strangers now lingered after class to chat and laugh together. The dojo buzzed with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Even Sensei Robert had noticed. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave, he called her over. "You've done something incredible here," he said, his voice filled with pride. Emily tilted her head, surprised. "I just taught a few classes," she said modestly. "It's more than that," Robert insisted. "You've shown them what strength really looks like, not just in how to fight, but in how to face themselves." Emily felt a flicker of warmth at his words, but quickly redirected the focus. "It's not just me," she said. "They've done the work. I just gave them the space to do it." Robert smiled knowingly. "And that's the mark of a true leader." Meanwhile, Jake's transformation began to ripple beyond the dojo. He started speaking up in class, no longer trying to coast through unnoticed. He joined group projects willingly, his input thoughtful and measured. Professors who once dismissed him as a troublemaker began to see a student with potential. His friends, too, followed suit. Travis volunteered to tutor younger students struggling with math. Nick took on a part-time job at the campus gym, channeling his energy into fitness rather than bravado. Matt and Connor joined a community outreach program, teaching basic self-defense to local high schoolers. The whispers around campus shifted again. No longer the subjects of ridicule or curiosity, Jake and his crew were now seen as examples of what it meant to grow and change. For Emily, the most rewarding moment came during an unplanned encounter on campus. She was walking to class when she overheard two students talking nearby. "Did you hear about that self-defense club? People are saying it's life-changing," one said. "Yeah, I've been thinking about joining," the other replied. "That Emily Carter, she's something else." Emily kept walking, her expression calm, but inside, she felt a quiet pride. She wasn't seeking recognition, but knowing she had made an impact filled her with a sense of purpose. That evening, as she locked up the dojo, Jake appeared once more. "I've been thinking about what's next," he said, his tone reflective. Emily raised an eyebrow. "What's next for what?" "For me," Jake replied. "I don't want to just take from this place. I want to give something back. Emily nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. That's how you know you've really changed, she said. Jake grinned, a rare moment of unguarded joy. Maybe. But I've still got a lot to learn. Emily tilted her head. We all do, she said. As the door clicked shut behind them, Emily felt a sense of closure. The night behind the library had been the start of something she could never have predicted. It wasn't just a fight, it was the catalyst for transformation, not just for Jake and his friends, but for herself and the community they had built together. Strength wasn't just about winning battles. It was about the quiet resilience to keep moving forward, to inspire others, and to find purpose in every challenge. Emily Carter had always been strong, but now she understood the true depth of her power, and she knew she wasn't alone in it. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.